Hi everyone. So this is an academic skills session looking at academic writing. When we're talking about academic writing, there's a lot of things that we need to think about, and I'm going to work through these. But one thing to understand is that these are not hard and fast rules a lot of the time. These are general rules which every so often you will see people perhaps using in different ways or shifting depending on a few different things. And one of the things to understand is that academic writing is a little bit different depending on what you are writing for, where you are writing for, and what discipline you're writing for. So what we might expect in terms of academic writing in something like media studies or communications might be a little bit different to what you might be expected if you're writing it for marketing or even for sociology, and certainly different for if you're writing for psychology or one of the hard sciences. So it's important to understand that these rules and guides are based on the sorts of things that we are likely to be looking for within our discipline. But you may find that when you're reading other pieces, they don't necessarily conform to this. While it's not the end of the world, it is relatively important to try to get your tone right for your intended audience. And because of that, these are important key ideas to have underlying what it is that you're writing. One of the first things to understand is that academic writing is not one single thing. It's a combination of a number of different elements which all come together to form something which we call academic writing. It involves having a specific kind of structure to your work, a particular tone to the language that you use. Usually there is an argument involved, it's not just descriptive. That argument is always supported, it has background material which supports the argument. Academic writing will almost always have referencing to it, and it will be done drawing on or on the basis of research. So all of these elements come together to create what we describe as being academic writing. So there's a lot of things to be juggling, to be thinking about when you're doing academic writing. It takes some time when you're first adjusting to it to really focus on it. The longer you do it, the more practice that you get, the more it just becomes second nature. The first thing to consider when approaching a piece of academic writing is to think about what type of academic writing you're being asked to do, because the way in which you approach it is going to be slightly different depending on what it is that you're actually writing. And there are lots of different types of academic writing. I've suggested a couple here. This is certainly not an exhaustive list. There are lots of other different types and forms as well. The most common thing that you're going to be asked to do is what we would call a research essay or an academic essay. This is a form which is very common, especially within the humanities. And it's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. There are also things like a report. Now, a report is much less likely to have an argument in it. It's much more about getting a set of information across. So you'll go out, you'll find out a set of information, and you will find the most clear and appropriate and structured way to get that information across. Scientific writing has its own set of particular structures and norms and dynamics. It's often much shorter than academic writing, and it's much more about still in some ways making an argument, but an argument that is backed up by usually scientific research, and one which is about presenting results in a ways in which humanities writing often is not. The last one is to think about academic writing for a presentation. It's important to recognize that the way in which you express an idea in an academic essay and the way in which you express an idea in a presentation are two slightly different things. The way that I'm explaining things to you now is not necessarily the same way that I would if I were writing it down in a textbook for you. So you need to think a little bit about things like tone of delivery, things like the rhythm of speech. You may notice that I often, when I'm speaking, have a certain set of rhythms to what I'm saying. I'll give one point, and then I'll give another point, I'll give another point. I'll list things out in a certain way. That's not something that I would do were I writing it down in a book or an academic essay. However, when giving a presentation, it can be a particularly persuasive mode of delivery. So you need to think a little bit about what is the end result that I need to achieve? What type of writing am I being asked to do? And what is it specifically about that type of writing that I need to create? When we're thinking about academic writing in the humanities, the sort of academic writing that we're talking about, especially for writing an academic essay or a research essay, there are a few elements that are almost always there. The writing will have a clear and limited focus. And what I mean by that is that the essay itself will set out very clearly, right at the start, what it is that it is going to be focused on. And that focus is going to have boundaries. It's going to have a limit. It's going to be saying, I'm looking at this concept in terms of this case study, for example. And that means that the writing itself has bounds. That means that the reader knows right from the start what sort of parameters you, the author, is drawing on. Academic writing is almost always built on a logical structure. Exactly what that structure is can change a little bit. What matters is that each section, each paragraph flows logically from one to the next. So the reader isn't suddenly thrown by the introduction of a completely different idea or a different tangent. Academic writing is built on evidence-based arguments. That means that you lay out an argument that you are making as the author, and then you support that argument with the evidence that you've collated, whether that's from your own analysis, whether that's from research material, whether that's from drawing on other people's conclusions and combining them together. These are all different ways of supporting an argument, but there is always that evidence there to support the argument. And lastly, academic writing has a formal tone. Now, this doesn't mean that it is overcomplicated. A formal tone can be very simple and very clear, but it means that it has to it a mode of address, a style, which has a level of formality to it. In some ways, academic tone can be one of the most difficult elements to come to grips with. And that's partially because it's very hard to lay out a precise method to follow in order to get academic tone right. However, there are a few common mistakes and common things which we would encourage you to do in order to get academic tone close to right. So a couple of things that academic tone is not. It is not overly complicated sentences. People often feel like in order to try and sound more academic, they need to overly complicate their writing. Academic writing should be clear and understandable. Sometimes when you are reading some especially older academic writing, you will find that it is quite dense and convoluted. But hopefully when you read more recent academic writing, you will see that there is a much more pressure put on it for it to be clear, for it to be understandable. Academic tone and academic writing should not be filled with jargon. And by jargon, we mean using technical terms all over the place. Often, a technical term, a concept, is important or necessary for the work that you're doing. But don't assume that your reader will understand what a technical term is. If you need to use a piece of jargon, if you need to use a particular technical term, then you need to explain what that term means in your own words to the reader. And that serves two purposes. It makes sure that the reader understands it, but also it makes it clear how you, as the author, is understanding it. Often a technical term can have multiple different definitions or understandings for different people in different spheres, and so it's really important to understand how you are intending it to be understood in your writing. Academic tone should be clear. It should be really simple to see how you are making each point and how each point leads from one to the next. And while it is not overly complicated, academic tone should be formal. What we mean by formal is that it doesn't use contractions like didn't or wouldn't, but instead would use did not or would not. It doesn't use idioms or casual speech, and it doesn't use slang. So those are key things to just guide how you structure and present your academic tone. Lastly, here are a few general guidelines for academic tone, things to avoid in your writing. And these are being pointed out because these are things that we see a lot in student writing. And it's really useful to try to work to restrict them as much as possible. The first is to avoid making broad generalizations. In other words, if you're using the words always or never, you want to make sure that you can actually justify those words. Do you really mean always, or do you mean a lot of the time? Do you genuinely mean never, or do you mean not very often? Do you mean always in a particular group of people, but actually other people might do something differently? So think about those broad generalizations and how you are presenting them in your work. You should avoid making use of what I've described here as oversweeping adjectives, things which present something as being overstated. Things like outstanding and obvious. A really common thing to find in student work is the phrase, "It is obvious that." If it's obvious, tell me why it's obvious. Is it obvious to everybody? Or is that something which you find obvious, but other people may question or critique in other ways? So those are words to be very tentative with using. You should avoid using adverbs like really and clearly. If parts of speech are not your forte, adverbs are parts of speech which modify a verb or modify an adjective. So saying something like really, which emphasizes the word which comes after, does nothing apart from adding emphasis. It's not adding anything of value to your work. You should also avoid qualifiers like a little and definitely. Again, the problem with things like qualifiers is that they don't actually give you any kind of definition. A little doesn't tell me anything. Definitely doesn't add anything to your work. You should, in your work, avoid emotional language or emotive language. The idea that you might write something like, "It is heartbreaking that so many are starving." While it is heartbreaking that so many are starving, this is not the kind of language which really helps you to make an argument within an academic essay. Avoid generalizations that are based on your understanding of your or other people's emotions. And tied in with that, you should avoid inflammatory language. So saying that Smith's study was terrible or sickening or sad, these are not particularly useful things to add. If you think it was a poorly designed study, then say that it was a poorly designed study. Calling it bad or terrible doesn't add anything to the point that you are making. So I think that actually what summarizes all of these don'ts is actually precision. A lot of this language is there to give language color, to give language shape, but it doesn't add anything in terms of precision of the point you are trying to get across. So think about how you can express something as clearly and as precisely as possible, and you are going to get as close as you can to academic tone.